This is the Craig Fahle Show on Deadline Detroit. Thank you very much for being with us as we broadcast live from the Detroit Regional Chamber's annual Mackinac Policy Conference. My guest right now, U.S. Senator Gary Peters, Democrat, of course, from Michigan. Thank you for being here.
Great to be with you, Craig.
Formerly my congressional representative as well, in what I like to call the 14th Super District, because it's shaped like the S on Superman's chest, which makes no sense. Why don't we get into that subject for just a minute? We're waiting for a court ruling on gerrymandering in Michigan.
Right.
Your thoughts on the decisions that the lower courts have made thus far about that? Did you agree? I mean, even though you won that district, the way that Michigan was cut up in the congressional races in the state Senate was really bizarre.
Oh, it was bizarre. There's no question that you need to bring some rhyme and reason to the districting. It was clear in the case. I think they really were able to outline that. They had some pretty compelling evidence as well that the Republicans, as they were drawing it, had clear political intent to pack Democrats in a couple of districts to be able to be more competitive in other districts. And the redistricting process needs to change. That's why I'm very pleased with Proposal 2 that passed, where we're going to have an independent commission that will draw those lines after the 2020 census. I think that's the kind of reform we need. You need to have competitive districts where there's a real election in the general election, not just in the primaries, to bring folks more towards finding common ground. I think it'll deal with some of the polarization you see in Congress and in the legislative branches as well.
Well, and you guys had a press conference about that very subject today, talking about cooperation, bipartisan cooperation that you guys are trying to, at least from the region and in the state of Michigan in particular, are showing around issues around the Great Lakes, things that you can agree on. Given this hyper-partisan atmosphere we've been in for the last few years, and it certainly seems that way, is it different on the ground as to what's actually going on in the level of cooperation that does exist in Washington?
Well, there's a couple levels as to where the cooperation is. So on some of the real big issues, that's been tough to get people together, and quite frankly, we have a president that is very polarizing, to say the least, which makes it difficult for people to come together. But at least in the Senate, and I found the Senate, I've served in the House, as you mentioned, now in the Senate, I find the Senate is different, primarily because it's smaller. There are 100 of us in the Senate. You actually get to know all 100 folks. When you're in the House with 435, it's tough to get to know people just in your own party, let alone the other side. In the Senate, we do get to know each other. A lot of our rules require unanimous consent. The Senate is not designed to act real quickly, so you need to have everybody agree. And in order to get everybody to agree, you usually have to have some relationships, and you don't want to be disagreeable because people will remember that too. So there are a lot of areas where I work with my Republican colleagues. I'll introduce legislation, and most times, more often than not, I'll get a Republican co-sponsor where I find that we can find some common ground and work together to try to pass things.
Are there limits to what that's going to be good for, though? I mean, obviously, if you're talking about protection of the Great Lakes, restoring funding for the Great Lakes Initiative, things along those lines, you can get a lot of cooperation around things that we all recognize as being valuable. Clean water, obviously one of them. Cleaning up PFAS contamination. We're starting to get some coalescence around that issue as well. How important is it to find those couple of things? And does that ever lead to broader cooperation on other issues that may be more contentious?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, obviously those are different than the contentious ones. And if you're talking about some of the big issues, whether it's immigration or healthcare, some of those are very contentious. But the other bills that we can all agree on, and some other bills that I think are more common sense and how we make things more efficient. One, we should be doing that because we got to get those done as well, and the American people expect us to get that done, and we want to be able to do what's good for the state of Michigan as well. But through that experience, you also develop relationships that help you have at least more meaningful conversations on some of the tougher issues. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm now the ranking member on Homeland Security. Overseeing the Homeland Security Department, and it's a lot of contentious issues related to border security. The chair of that committee is Ron Johnson, who's a very conservative Republican from Wisconsin. His politics is different than me as a Democrat from Michigan, but we have a really good working relationship, and we are able to really kind of find some common ground, and I hope we're able to move the ball forward on some real concrete solutions to what is some big problems. But that wouldn't happen if you didn't have the relationship.
Well, last week, I believe, it was just a few days ago, you went down to the U.S.-Mexico border, correct?
Right.
The southern border. What did you find out down there? What were you looking for?
Well, we want to get a sense of what exactly is happening there and what's the process that we're going through. We have a very large number of families that are coming across from Central America, and we want to make sure that we're following the law and there's proper due process, but find out how can we speed up the process, because the folks who have legitimate asylum claims certainly are entitled to full due process under. We are a country of laws, and we need to follow those laws. But there are other folks that may not have credible claims, and we should be able to process them more quickly and repatriate them back. Those are not easy issues, though, and so we wanted to get a sense and see exactly what's happening with our CBP officers.
Well, but the approach that we've seen so far from the administration has been, let's just see if we can't find a way to close off the border, stop all immigration at this point in time, has actually been suggested before, and also cutting off aid to those very countries where those people are fleeing. The response to the crisis seems to be solely aimed at ignoring it, finding a way to ignore it and not have the U.S. be a part of any solution to this issue. How realistic is this in terms of what we need to do? And frankly, are you concerned about the level of aid going to some of these countries like Honduras where these problems are happening?
Yeah, it's and what the president did made no sense to me and made no sense to folks who are working on this issue. And he's certainly not looking at this in a thoughtful, comprehensive way. And his rhetoric poisons a lot of our ability to deal with it. You talked about aid to help countries in Central America. That's very important because there are two things. There's push factors and there are pull factors. The pull factors would be if people think they can easily get into the country, that may pull more people towards it. But there are real push factors. You've got an economy that is very weak. The economic conditions in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are extremely poor as a result of droughts that have impacted agricultural yields. People have a hard time feeding themselves. You've got drug cartels that dominate things down there, and the level of violence is very high, and the amount of extortion that goes on. I'll say a lot of those drug cartels, they make all their money because they're feeding the opioid epidemic in the United States and the drug demand that we have up here. But it makes it very unsafe for folks. And so being able to try to deal with some of those issues that people are dealing with, hopefully to keep them in their country as opposed to them making a trek and showing up on our border. So those are important investments to try to deal with the situation. And the president wasn't, he said, we're not going to give money to corrupt governments. Folks need to remember most of the money that we sent down there went to non-governmental organizations and religious groups and others that are trying to deal with the humanitarian issues in those countries. So if people don't feel like they have to head to the United States for their own survival.
Well, you mentioned the opioid crisis, and I do want to talk about this because this is a homeland security issue.
It is, no question.
So are you seeing any ideas coming out in terms of combating this that makes sense to you right now? Because it doesn't show any signs of slowing. In fact, the amount of fentanyl that's actually entering the country is increasing, and a lot of it's starting to be manufactured around here. Apparently, it's not that hard to do.
Yeah.
How are we going to deal with this in an effective way? Because, frankly, you see people that would never be caught up in the drug trade that are getting caught up in this.
Well, again, another complex issue, but it's really related to the demand. We got to stop the demand. You talked about fentanyl coming in, and the experience has been if the demand is there for a product, it'll find a way into the country. And we spend a lot of money trying to interdict and intercept, and they do. We do interdict and intercept a lot of it, but there's a lot more coming in because the demand is so high. So we have to treat this for the problem that it is, which is a public health crisis. Folks are dying regularly. In fact, talking to the executive of Macomb County, Mark Ackle, he was saying someone dies in Macomb County every day of a drug overdose, a heroin overdose. It is a crisis that we have to deal with. But there's many facets. One, we want to deal with the medical community that has probably overprescribed opioids to deal with issues. So they've come a long way, though. They realize that they've got to change their ways, and doctors are really reevaluating when they do that, when it's appropriate. We also have to make sure our drug store chains are keeping good records of what scripts they're filling, so you don't have someone with a fake script that goes to 5 drugstores and gets 5 scripts filled. They should not allow that to happen. Got to have pharmaceutical companies that are being responsible in the way that they distribute their drugs. We've got to have treatment programs in place. I worked on legislation that actually got passed to deal with medicated assisted treatment, which is probably one of the most effective ways to wean someone off of heroin products, for example. But in the past, you could only give that to individuals 18 and older, but adolescents are every bit susceptible to all of this, and we're seeing increasing levels of addiction with adolescents. We're now going to try to make it so physicians can treat those folks as well.
When you look at it, though, from a Homeland Security perspective, in terms of the way that Homeland Security has typically worked and the projects they've typically taken on, obviously you're doing anti-terrorism investigations, there's a lot of border issues and that kind of stuff, enforcement sort of things. But is there a way to utilize some of the resources for that massive department, frankly, in terms of actually treating the problem within the country's borders, not just an external threat?
Well, I think the department would deal with the border issue.
Yeah.
The internal, I think, where some of those resources are the departments of Health and Human Services, for example. Our health departments is that it's a public health crisis, not a law enforcement.
Like I said, it's also a security issue.
Well, it is. It's security, and the security issue is that it makes our borders more susceptible to bad actors and smugglers that come across. There's no question about that, and I don't disagree. But we treat it through the public health departments and as a health crisis.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the borders for just a second, because obviously we're spending a lot of focus discussing the southern border and talking about, frankly, immigration reform strictly through a southern border sort of perspective. What do we need to know about what's happening at the northern border right now, and what needs to be shored up that's going to make that more effective?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I remind my colleagues in Washington regularly, we have a northern border in this country. It's not just the southern border. You wouldn't know that by all of the rhetoric. And the northern border is critically important to Michigan's economy as well. It's interesting if you look at the volume of trade that goes through a port of entry in North America. Of the 3 busiest ports of entry, 2 of them are in Michigan. Mm-hmm. Laredo, Texas is number 1. Detroit, Windsor 2. Port Huron, Sarnia 3. And the Department of Homeland Security has a difficult job. They have to first and foremost, and I think this is our priority, keep us safe, keep the borders secure. I think it's a fundamental job of the federal government to keep us all safe. But 2, they also have to allow trade and commerce to move as efficiently and as quickly as possible, especially with our manufacturing industry here and just-in-time delivery. And as products come across, they got to be at the factory right on time. And if they're not, the whole supply chain gets messed up. So, how do you move that forward? And we have a problem that I'm working to deal with now is that we're seeing CBP, Customs Border Protection folks being transferred down to the southern border, and that means traffic backups, slower processing across the border, and that has an impact on jobs here in Michigan.
Well, you are a senator from Michigan, so a couple of things that you have to worry about, obviously manufacturing and agriculture, both of them with a bit of uncertainty right now over the issue of tariffs. We just got an aid package passed for farmers who are going to be impacted by these tariffs that are being put on agricultural products. We may or may not see automotive tariffs coming in back. We don't know what's going to happen. Aluminum, steel, we've already seen some impacts of this. What questions are you getting from businesses here and the farmers in the state about the policy and what can happen there?
Well, I think farmers are particularly concerned. All of them, all of the above to your question. But I'll tell you the thing that's we have to worry about on farmers. But before I mention that, first, we have to make sure that trade rules are followed, and we need to make sure that the Chinese are violating them. You have to stand up to that, but you have to do it in a thoughtful way, in a strategic way. And we can talk about that. I don't think the president has been doing that. But the farmers are concerned that they will start losing markets because folks still need to buy food products, and if the United States isn't selling it to them, they'll go somewhere else. And usually once they go somewhere else, they don't come back. So this is not a short-term problem for farmers. They're concerned that their export markets, they're going to lose them. And if they lose their export markets, temporary subsidies that the president is giving the farmers now, who they say they don't want temporary money, they want to be able to export their products, and they're afraid in the future they're going to be impacted. That's wrong. So
what would be a more effective policy in your mind? Again, if you're talking about making sure that intellectual property rights are not being stolen by Chinese companies, is there a possibility that we could see a rule change for businesses that are doing business in China, that they don't have to necessarily pair up with a nationalistic company in China?
Right.
Because they're just basically ripping off patents.
Well, they are. Yeah, they are, and that cannot be tolerated. We have to be tough.
How do you do it?
But I think part of it when you have tariff strategy is you're a more targeted approach. You don't have wholesale tariffs across everything. You take it on a targeted basis. The president didn't do that. In fact, I think you want to go into these kinds of negotiations with your friends and your allies with you, because they're having the same problems. The Canadians, for example, are having the same problems with China. But instead, the president imposed tariffs on the Canadians on steel tariffs, so picking a fight with our friends. And so when you go against China, we're going it alone. You're a lot stronger when you go with your friends, because if the Chinese are going to have countervailing tariffs, they aren't going to do countervailing tariffs to the whole world. That would be that's not something that would benefit the China. They can't do it. So that's where you have the negotiating position to say, we're not, as the world community, we're going to put our foot down and not tolerate you stealing our intellectual property.
That international cooperation has been a hallmark of every administration going back in my entire life, obviously. You need some sort of consensus before you move forward on things like going to war, for instance. trade battles, all this kind of stuff. We're going away from that. How do we restore it? Is there a possibility, or are some of these relationships damaged permanently?
Well, I think
these are our best allies in many instances.
Yeah, we've seen an administration turn on our best allies. I think things. It's not. I hope it's not permanent, because those other allies know they need the United States as well. We all need each other. That's just the way the world community works. So a change of administration that has a different approach, I think that would be welcomed by folks.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the Senate right now. Mitch McConnell made a bit of a statement yesterday in terms of Supreme Court vacancy, if one arises. It was a hypothetical that he was asked about, and they said, well, what happens if Supreme Court Justice dies next year? It's an election year. He said, and we'll fill it. We'll fill it. Which I guarantee you raised the ire of the Democrats, obviously, in the wake of the Merrick Garland stuff.
Absolutely.
What's that relationship like right now with the leadership in the Senate? And is this the kind of thing that interferes with other business getting done?
There's no question it interferes, and Mitch McConnell has been an impediment to that. And when you just look at what he's been doing the last 8 weeks or so, is that when the floor time on the U.S. Senate is very precious time. It's a limited amount of time you have to get the people's work done. And basically the last 8 weeks, all we've done are judicial nominations. There's been no legislating going on. Mitch McConnell is not moving any legislation to deal with the problems.
Well, Andy Levin was complaining about that a little bit earlier on the program.
Absolutely, and so the House is passing a number of pieces of legislation related to education, related to health care, protecting the Great Lakes, all the things that we care deeply about. Senate's not moving it because he's moving just nominations. It only takes a majority vote. They changed the rules, so it's only a majority vote for lifetime appointments to the federal judiciary. He also changed the rules on debate. It used to be 30 hours of debate. You could go up to 30 hours of debate for a lifetime appointment, split evenly, 15 for Democrats, 15 for Republicans. The Republicans changed that now. There's only 2 hours of debate, 1 hour of debate from the Democrats for candidates who will have a lifetime appointment. Many of these judges are not particularly well qualified, and they tend to be in their late 30s and early 40s. They're going to be around a long time.
So how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel very frustrated and angry. That's why politics, or I should say elections, do matter, and it's really why I'm going to be working very hard to make sure we have a Democratic U.S. Senate.
All right. Gary Peters, Senator Gary Peters, thank you very much for your time, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Craig.
And this is the Craig Fahle Show on Deadline Detroit.